The president has seemed to back off any further escalation of the trade war with China this week. Over the last month, the United States announced additional tariffs on Chinese goods and labeled China as a currency manipulator.
A move championed by our next guest, Robert Scott. In a recent Hill op-ed, he wrote, quote, "Designating China as a currency manipulator is long overdue, but it's hardly a cure-all. What's needed is an approach that addresses the fundamental causes of current trade imbalances." Here to explain more is Robert himself. He's a senior economist and director of trade and manufacturing policy research with the Economic Policy Institute. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you, Robert. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this trade war. The president has obviously escalated the tariffs to several hundred billion worth of Chinese goods. He's finally labeled China currency manipulator, something he told us he would do on his first day in office. But you don't seem to think he's living up to really what it takes to restoring our trade relationship with China.
No, that's right. In fact, if you look at what's actually going on in the world, our trade deficit with China and the world is actually growing. So all the tariffs Trump has imposed have not achieved their end goal. So we need to step back and ask, what's causing our trade problems? These problems have cost us 5 million manufacturing jobs over the last 20 years. And this has been really devastating, especially for working people without college degrees. So what do we need to do? The primary cause of the growing trade deficits is really two things. Unfair trade for countries like China, we're right to target them, but even more importantly, the rising value of the U.S. dollar. That has gained 25% in the last 5 years, and that makes U.S. imports cheaper. It acts like a subsidy to everything we buy from China and the rest of the world. And it acts like a tax on all of our exports. So both of those hurt U.S. manufacturing. It's a double whammy. We're competing with cheap imports. We can't sell exports, so manufacturers really take it as a result.
Right. Well, what have you seen? So we've seen a little bit of Chinese manipulation of their own currency in order to try and deal with these tariffs. That only makes it even more so of an imbalance. Is that right?
Absolutely. China's currency in the last year alone has risen. Sorry, China's currency has fallen by about 12%.
Right.
And that has helped push down the U.S. Push up the U.S. dollar, which is up about 8 or 9% in the same period of time. But the problem is really global. And what's causing it today is not just China's currency manipulation. The big cause is the flood of private money coming into the U.S., chasing the stock market and U.S. bonds, which pay more than bonds in the rest of the world. So what do we need to do to address that? There is a new bill that's been proposed by Senator Tammy Baldwin and Wisconsin, and Josh Hawley from Missouri, bipartisan bill that would authorize the government to impose a tax on those capital inflows to slow down the hot money coming into the U.S., reduce the demand for U.S. dollars. That will reduce the value of a dollar and automatically make U.S. goods more competitive on world markets. That will solve the fundamental cause of our trade problems.
Interesting.
So I want to bring climate into this conversation.
Sure.
If you could wave a magic wand, you could set the policy and you could rebalance trade in the way that you propose, what would the climate impact of that be? And if you took climate into account, what would be kind of the ideal way to think about trade going forward?
Well, one of the problems we have with climate is that we've shifted an enormous amount of production to countries like China. China has had a tenfold increase in steel production. Today, China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, much larger than the U.S. So when we buy our steel or our cars or even our computer chips from China, they're generating a lot more carbon. They're making the climate worse. If we produce those goods here in the United States, we produce them to the highest environmental standards. So that will actually reduce the impact of goods production on the economy. Now we can go further, and let's say we were to start to impose carbon taxes, as many economists have proposed. We can also do that at the border and apply those carbon taxes to those dirty goods coming in from other countries.
That's interesting.
Would the pressure on China push them towards dirtier and dirtier energy and production, or do you see them moving away from coal-fired economy?
Well, today, China is doing everything it can do, and has been for the past 20 or 30 years, to subsidize the production of exports. That means keeping energy prices cheap, subsidizing the cost of coal and other commodities that are used to make steel and glass and other things we buy from China. I think China's incentive structure, the way they've set their economy, is to keep cheap. Keep those supplies cheap and not to impose strict environmental controls. We can change China's behavior. Again, if we tax them at the border, for every ton of carbon emitted in the production, say, of a ton of steel, that's going to give them an incentive to cut those carbon emissions.
Yeah.
So we can do that.
Robert, let's start from a little bit more of like a 50,000-foot view. For we have been told for decades by some of these experts that we can subsist together in the global economy, that it's not a zero-sum game between American manufacturing and the American economy and the Chinese economy. And for that, some of these people even say that they welcome the One Belt, One Road initiative or the Made in 2025 China plan. Why do you think that that's not the case?
Well, in fact, we're in a global economic competition with China, and we've been losing that game for at least 20 years. We need to rebalance global trade, and by realigning the dollar vis-a-vis the Chinese yuan, the Japanese yen, and especially the European euro, we can rebalance global trade. We can take back control of our own economy and manufacturing sector by doing that. I think we do need to address the challenge imposed by this China One Belt initiative. One way to do that is to take more control of the spending we do with our own dollars to maximize the American content of what the government buys, for example, through greatly expanded Buy America programs. And also, of course, we need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to make sure that the money that we spend stays in the United States to buy American steel and glass and equipment to upgrade those systems.
I also want to talk about the role of the Federal Reserve here, which is, so President Trump obviously is extremely angry with the Federal Reserve. He says that they're not pursuing monetary policy properly. Now, what do you think about that? I think I have a little bit of an idea, but it's also more of an interesting historical debate of, are we returning to the era where money is political and not managed by bureaucrats in the Fed?
Well, the Fed was set up intentionally to insulate us, to be insulated from political pressures, and Trump is not the first president to try and jawbone the Fed into reducing interest rates in order to stimulate the economy in time for an election. This has been done before. The Fed is used to resisting such pressures. So I don't think that we have yet entered an era where that independence of the Fed is threatened. And in fact, the Hawley-Baldwin bill that we talked about earlier would give the Fed new tools to manage the dollar, which is one of the things that's most interesting about this proposal. The Fed would be in charge of that process of setting this charge that will be applied to incoming capital flows. So I think the Fed's a critical player, and their independence should be protected.
Do you think China can weather this? I've heard people make both arguments, but the argument against is that they've been really running on fumes the last 5, 6, 10 years or so, and everybody thinks there's a crisis right around the corner, inflated assets, bogus banks, etc. Do you think that they have the ability to outlast Trump here, or do you think they're bluffing a little bit and kind of panicking behind the scenes?
I think China certainly takes the long view on the global economy, and of course President Xi's term is unlimited. He can be reappointed as many times as he wants. It's not really it's certainly not a democracy. He doesn't have to run for election. He just has a central committee he needs to convince. And his current term, I think, extends till 2023, far beyond that of President Trump. So I think they have decided that they understand Trump. His bark in many ways is worse than his bite. He threatens tariffs and he backs off. They're just going to let him play that game, and I think they're going to wait him out until after the election.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Next on Rising, Greta Thunberg arrived by boat in New York yesterday as part of her advocacy for an international effort on climate change.
And she's just one figure in a global youth movement tackling the crisis. Our conversation with one of the leaders in the Sunrise movement when Rising returns.